Have you ever received a gift from someone you love and felt, almost instantly, that accepting it meant giving something up in return, even if you couldn't yet explain what that something was? And what if the moment you smiled and said thank you was also the moment you quietly lost control over parts of your life you didn't know could be taken? My birthday had already lowered its expectations that year, as birthdays often do when you're older, turning into quiet markers of survival rather than celebration. But when my daughter appeared at my door holding a wrapped box and a smile that arrived a second too late, I felt that familiar mix of relief and caution, because at a certain age surprise attention doesn't feel purely generous anymore. It feels like something that might come with instructions. She hugged me, asked about my health, asked if I was managing on my own, and those questions landed heavier than she intended, because they weren't just questions, they were assessments. And when she placed the box in my hands and said, "This will make things easier for you," I realized she hadn't asked whether I wanted things to change at all. Inside was a tablet, new, expensive, and already logged into something before I'd even touched it. And as she sat beside me insisting she set it up herself, creating passwords I wasn't shown and explaining features I didn't request, I felt that small internal alarm older people learn to silence quickly, the one that says something important is shifting and you're expected to cooperate. I told myself not to resist, because resistance gets mistaken for confusion, and confusion is how you lose authority without ever being told you've lost it. So I watched her move through my digital life as if it were already hers to organize, reassure me that everything was safer this way, simpler this way, better this way. When she left, promising to check in more often now that I was connected, the house felt quieter than it should have, and the tablet sat on the table glowing faintly, already demanding attention, already holding more access than I remembered giving. And I noticed how quickly help had transformed into oversight without a single argument taking place. Over the next day, then the next, small things began to feel misplaced rather than missing. Notifications I used to receive stopped arriving. Routines I trusted felt subtly interrupted. And when I reached for answers, I hesitated, because questioning your own child feels like accusing yourself of failure. I reminded myself that love sometimes feels uncomfortable, that care can look clumsy, that maybe this was just the cost of staying relevant in a world that moves faster than aging bodies do. But underneath those reassurances was a growing awareness that something irreversible might already be underway. Something I had agreed to by being polite, by being grateful, by not wanting to seem difficult. By the end of that week, as I stared at a screen that knew more about my affairs than I could easily access myself, I realized the gift hadn't just entered my home. It had quietly inserted itself between me and my own decisions, and the most unsettling part wasn't that my daughter had taken initiative. It was that I no longer knew what she was capable of doing in my name, or how far things had already gone before I thought to ask. The moment I realized something was wrong came when I tried to move money I'd moved the same way for years and discovered I couldn't, not because it was gone, but because I no longer had access to approve it myself, and that distinction unsettled me more than loss ever could. I stared at the tablet, convinced I'd missed a step, but the screen offered no error, no warning, just calm confirmations that the action had already been handled, as if my involvement was unnecessary. I searched for records I trusted, statements I recognized, but everything appeared filtered, summarized, simplified, and the more I looked, the clearer it became that I wasn't being blocked. I was being guided, led gently away from details that used to belong to me. For a moment I considered that this might be my mistake, that I'd simply forgotten how things worked. But that explanation collapsed quickly when I realized the device wasn't asking me to verify anything anymore. It was assuming I agreed. Over the next few days, the pattern widened, messages rerouted without my input, notifications replaced by reassurances, decisions confirmed before I remembered making them, and none of it felt aggressive enough to confront, which made it more dangerous because every change arrived already settled. When my daughter called, her voice was light, efficient, and when I mentioned the confusion carefully, choosing my words so I wouldn't sound alarmed, she interrupted gently and said that was exactly why she'd streamline things, because I didn't need the stress of managing every detail now. I didn't argue, partly because she sounded reasonable, and partly because I couldn't yet name what had been taken, only that something fundamental had shifted without discussion. That afternoon, a letter arrived referencing an authorization I didn't recall granting, and when I checked the tablet for context, it offered outcomes without origins, confirmations without memory, and I understood then that whatever had changed had done so cleanly, through systems that trust efficiency more than consent. I sat there longer than I intended, holding a device that spoke confidently on my behalf, and the most unsettling realization wasn't that something improper had occurred, but that everything appeared perfectly in order, just arranged in a way that no longer required me. By the end of the week, it became impossible to ignore that this wasn't about convenience or care. It was about control being reassigned quietly, and once that happens, the process doesn't pause to ask whether you're comfortable with the next step. The first time I tried to push back, I did it carefully, casually, the way you do when you're afraid that sounding too firm might confirm suspicions you don't want attached to you, and I asked my daughter if we could go over a few things together, just so I could understand what had been changed. There was a pause on the line, brief but unmistakable, and when she answered, her voice softened in a way that felt practiced, explaining that everything was already handled and that revisiting it would only confuse me further. That word landed heavily, not as an insult but as a conclusion, because it reframed my concern as a symptom rather than a question. And suddenly the discussion wasn't about clarity, it was about my capacity to understand. I tried again, this time asking directly what permissions had been granted in my name, and she sighed gently, not with frustration but with patience, the kind that implies the matter has already been settled elsewhere, and reminded me that she was only doing what was best, that she wouldn't have taken control unless it had been necessary. In that moment, something shifted, not because she raised her voice, but because she assumed authority without asking whether I had agreed she should have it. After the call ended, I felt a mix of shame and anger that surprised me with its intensity, because nothing overtly cruel had been said. Yet my role had been reduced to someone whose cooperation was expected, not requested. 2 days later, a notice arrived confirming a change I had never discussed, one that affected how decisions would be handled going forward, and when I checked the tablet for details, I found a clean record of approval bearing my name, time-stamped, verified, and complete, as if I had been present when I knew I hadn't. I stared at that confirmation longer than I should have, because it wasn't just evidence of action, it was proof that my absence no longer slowed anything down. After that, the pattern sharpened, conversations referenced as resolved before they occurred, choices presented as follow-ups rather than options, and each time I hesitated, reassurance arrived faster than explanation. I began requesting records through channels that existed before the tablet, slower, less polished ones that still required my presence, and what emerged wasn't chaos or error, but a sequence of decisions that had progressed smoothly, efficiently, and without resistance because resistance had never been anticipated. The fear wasn't that she had acted recklessly, it was that she had acted correctly enough to be believed, and that meant undoing what had been done wouldn't come from a family conversation or an apology, it would come from proving that consent had been assumed where it had never been given. By then, silence no longer felt protective, it felt like permission, and I understood with unsettling clarity that whatever came next would not be handled privately, because the moment my name was used without me, the story had already left the family behind. The moment denial collapse didn't arrive with shouting or accusations, it arrived with a call that introduced itself as routine, a calm voice asking to confirm a few details connected to my name, and within seconds it was clear this wasn't curiosity, it was follow-up. I was asked whether I had personally authorized a change affecting how certain decisions would be handled going forward, and when I said no, there was no surprise on the line, only a brief pause before the next question, one that referenced a date, a time, and an approval that had already been logged. As the call continued, the distance between what had been done and what I had consented to became impossible to ignore, not because of accusation, but because of how carefully prepared the questions were, as if the answers were expected to confirm something already suspected. When the call ended, I sat staring at the tablet, realizing it was no longer just a tool my daughter had introduced, it was a record, a timeline of actions taken in my absence that could now be examined by people who had no emotional investment in preserving family harmony. 2 days later, a formal request arrived asking for copies of identification and confirmation of whether I had been present when specific authorizations were submitted, and that was when the situation shifted from concern to consequence, because those aren't questions asked unless a line has already been crossed. I contacted my daughter not to accuse her, but to tell her inquiries had begun, and the silence that followed felt different than before, stripped of reassurance, heavy with calculation, and when she finally replied, she didn't ask what they were investigating, she asked what I had said. That distinction mattered more than any explanation she could have offered, because it revealed where her concern truly lay. In the days that followed, additional requests came through formal channels, asking for timelines, access logs, confirmations that required documentation rather than trust. And I noticed how the process slowed, how approvals that once moved effortlessly now paused for verification. For the first time since my birthday, I wasn't being spoken to as someone who needed managing. I was being addressed as the primary authority, the person whose consent had weight precisely because it could no longer be assumed. The gravity of that shift settled in quietly, not as fear but as certainty, because once systems begin documenting what had previously been taken on faith, outcomes stopped being negotiable. And as I gathered what was requested piece by piece, I understood that whatever the truth revealed, it would no longer belong to interpretation or intention, only to what had been done in my name. The proof arrived quietly, not as an accusation but as a document I was asked to review, and the moment I recognized what it was, the air seemed to leave the room. It wasn't complicated or buried in legal language, it was a clear authorization form bearing my name, my identifying details, and a digital signature timestamped on a day I could account for down to the hour because I had been home alone, nowhere near the device that approved it. The form showed that control over specific financial decisions had been transferred outright, allowing actions to be taken without further confirmation, and as I read it, the last defense I'd been holding on to dissolved, because this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was delegation without consent. I was asked whether I had personally reviewed and submitted the authorization, and when I said no, the response wasn't disbelief, it was acknowledgement, the kind that comes when an outcome has already been anticipated. A day later, another record followed, smaller but more disturbing, confirming that a withdrawal had been approved under the same access. Not for an emergency, not for care, but for a transfer I hadn't initiated and wouldn't have agreed to if asked. It wasn't catastrophic in amount, but it didn't need to be, because its purpose wasn't damage, it was testing how far things could move without resistance. When I spoke to my daughter after that, her response shifted, not into denial but into minimization, explaining that it was temporary, necessary, something she intended to adjust once everything settled. That was when the final line was crossed, because temporary decisions don't require permanent access, and care doesn't need secrecy to function. As more records were reviewed, each one consistent in method if not scale, I understood that what had been taken wasn't just authority, it was time, the assumption that I wouldn't notice quickly enough to intervene, that delay would do the work confrontation never had to. The process moved forward after that, formally and without pause, and I was informed of next steps involving verification and escalation, steps that no longer depended on interpretation or intention. The weight of that moment wasn't anger or relief, it was resolve, because once proof replaces trust, the question stops being why someone acted and becomes how far they were willing to go before someone finally said no. Action didn't arrive as confrontation or punishment, it arrived as procedure, quiet and methodical. The kind that doesn't ask how you feel but requires that things stop moving forward until questions are resolved. I was informed that specific access privileges had been temporarily suspended pending review, not as an accusation but as a safeguard, and for the first time since my birthday, approvals that had once moved automatically now paused, waiting for confirmation that could only come from me. Forms followed, precise and limited, asking me to reaffirm boundaries that had been quietly crossed, and with each one completed, a small piece of control returned, not symbolically but functionally. Documentation was requested next, tied to exact dates and actions rather than general behavior, and as I gathered it, I noticed how the process narrowed, how the margin for explanation shrank as consistency replaced uncertainty. When my daughter learned that restrictions were in place, she didn't argue with the process itself. She argued with the timing, insisting it complicated things, insisting it made everything harder than it needed to be, and in that response I recognized how accustomed she had become to systems that didn't wait. Her tone changed after that, no longer reassuring or dismissive, but cautious, careful, measured against consequences she now understood she couldn't manage away. What unsettled me wasn't watching her lose control. It was realizing how easily control had been exercised when no one had been asking questions. As the review progressed, I was given a choice, clearly stated and formally documented, whether I wished to resolve the matter privately or allow it to proceed through established channels. And that decision, simple in wording, restored something fundamental, because it placed the direction of events back in my hands without requiring justification. I didn't answer immediately, not because I doubted what had occurred, but because I understood that whichever path I chose would define limits that could not later be softened or reframed. By then, the situation had moved beyond family intention and personal explanation. It had entered a space where actions are measured by record rather than motive, and as I prepared to respond, I recognized that the silence I had once used to preserve peace had reached its end, because from that point forward, inaction would no longer protect anyone, least of all me. The resolution didn't announce itself as justice or vindication, it arrived as confirmation. A notice explaining that the review had concluded and that corrective actions were being implemented effective immediately. Certain permissions were formally revoked, access paths closed, and decisions made without my consent were reversed or suspended pending independent verification. And the language of the message was neither sympathetic nor condemning, it was factual, final, and unmovable. I remember setting the tablet down after reading it, not with relief, but with a strange stillness, as if something that had been humming in the background of my life had finally gone quiet. I was informed that further matters would proceed without requiring my involvement unless requested, which was their way of saying the system now recognized where authority properly belonged. When I spoke to my daughter after that, there was no argument left to have, only the subdued realization that things had gone further than she expected, further than explanation could repair, and for the first time she didn't minimize or justify, she simply stopped speaking. That silence told me more than an apology ever could, because it marked the moment intention stopped maturing and records took over. The consequences that followed were procedural rather than personal, restrictions enforced, responsibilities reassigned, oversight introduced where trust had once been assumed, and none of it required my participation beyond consent, which had finally been returned to me. What surprised me most wasn't satisfaction or triumph, it was calm. The absence of vigilance I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The quiet assurance that decisions connected to my name would now wait for me again. I wasn't asked how I felt about the outcome because outcomes like this aren't designed to address feelings, they exist to correct imbalance, and that distinction mattered more than I expected. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic changed, relationships didn't suddenly heal, and life continued much as it had before, but with one crucial difference. Boundaries that had been quietly erased were now fixed in place. Looking back, I understood that delayed action hadn't been weakness. It had been endurance, and that silence, when it finally breaks, doesn't need volume to be effective. The story didn't end with punishment or reconciliation. It ended with authority returning to where it had always belonged, and with the quiet understanding as I went about my days again, that this time that was enough. These days, my life looks much the same on the surface. The same house, the same routines, the same quiet mornings, but something essential has shifted beneath it all. When I check my accounts now, I don't feel the need to hurry or double-guess myself, and when decisions wait, they wait for me. The tablet still sits on the table, but it no longer feels like it's watching me, and that simple change has brought a calm I didn't know I'd been missing. I don't speak more than I used to, and I don't explain myself any better, but I no longer carry the weight of wondering whether staying quiet has cost me something I can't get back. What I learned is that silence can be a choice, but it should never be the only one left to you. And patience only has value when it's paired with the certainty that your voice still matters when you decide to use it. I didn't need an apology to move forward, and I didn't need anyone to admit wrongdoing for things to be set right. What mattered was knowing that my name once again belonged to me, that decisions connected to my life would pause where they should, and that dignity doesn't need permission to exist. And with that settled, I was finally able to do something I hadn't done in a long time. Go back to living quietly, not because I was being overlooked, but because I chose to.